January 1st, 1944. British winter. A silence so heavy it seemed to press against the bones of every man standing on that abandoned training field. The dawn had not yet arrived, but a faint, metallic glow bled across the horizon, the kind of pale light that doesn't illuminate the world, but exposes its fears. Frozen mud cracked under the boots of engineers who had long forgotten what peaceful mornings felt like. The air was so cold it stung the lungs, and each exhale curled upward in slow, ghost-like spirals. At the center of that breathless circle of men stood a machine covered in frost and grime, a Sherman Jank no longer recognizable as armor, but as something transformed, something unnatural. The heavy drum attached to its front hung motionless, a monstrous jaw held shut by the chill. 30 chains dangled from it like the limbs of a dormant creature, each with an iron ball at its tip. Even in stillness, the sight provoked a discomfort that none of the men dared to name. Major John Fuller watched it in silence. He had seen death before, the sudden, violent kind and the slow, creeping kind that comes from exhaustion and hopelessness. He thought he understood fear, but this was different. This was the fear of a creator facing something he had brought into the world and realizing he might not control it. His gloves creaked softly as he tightened his grip. In his pocket rested the ignition key, a small, unimpressive piece of metal that felt absurdly inadequate for what it represented. Behind him, whispers traveled in short, uneven breaths. Some men prayed, others cursed softly. A few stared at the machine with something close to awe, as if trying to understand how an idea born from desperation could appear so calm, so harmless, when they knew it had already killed men during testing. A mechanic named Wallace had once described the machine's roar as the sound of the devil grinding his teeth. No one laughed when he said it. Even now, before the engine had turned, the men could feel the tension radiating from the tank, a kind of coiled violence waiting for permission to escape. The ground beneath their feet trembled faintly as Major Fuller approached the machine, not because the tank was moving, but because the men were holding their breath all at once, their fear vibrating in the frigid air. Every instinct screamed that humanity had crossed a boundary, that this machine wasn't merely dangerous, it was unpredictable, volatile, a weapon that seemed to resent its own existence. Fuller paused. For a moment, the world felt suspended, long enough for memories to flash through his mind. The letters he hadn't answered, the faces of men lost during previous tests, the moment he first realized that necessity was pushing them into darker territories than any blueprint could reflect. He inserted the key, and in that instant, before the engine roared, before the chains accelerated into the brutal blur that would smash minds into fire and soil, one truth washed over every man present. They were standing not at the birth of a weapon, but at the threshold of something far more disturbing, a machine not feared by the enemy, but by the very hands that created it. And as the first spark ignited inside the engine, and the chains began their terrifying march toward full rotation, the winter air carried a single, unspoken question. Can we survive our own invention? A question whose answer would shape the fate of Normandy and haunt its creators long after the war ended. By early 1944, the war in Europe had reached a point where hesitation itself had become a luxury no commander could afford. The Allies knew that liberation would not come through courage alone. It would require a precise, merciless confrontation with every barrier Germany had spent years preparing. And nowhere was that barrier more formidable or more invisible than beneath the waters along the French coast. The Atlantic Wall was more than concrete bunkers and artillery nests. It was a philosophy of annihilation engineered by German strategists. If the Allies dared to land, the ocean itself would become their executioner. Hundreds of thousands of mines had been planted in careful layers across the beaches of Normandy, some shallow, some deep, some triggered by weight, others by pressure, others by sound. Anti-tank mines large enough to tear a Churchill to pieces, anti-personnel mines designed to shred men before they reached the sand, explosive Belgian gates, steel tetrahedrons, wooden frames packed with charges, all arranged with mathematical cruelty to guarantee that the sea would ignite before the first rifleman could even see the enemy. Each minefield was not a random scattering of explosives. It was a deliberate trap, a labyrinth of buried death meant to stop an invasion not through bullets, but through physics, through shock waves violent enough to snap a landing craft in half, through pressure blasts designed to hurl men into the air like broken branches. Military planners in London pored over reconnaissance reports, tracing the German defenses until their fingers ached. The more they saw, the clearer it became. No invasion force on Earth could cross those beaches unless the minefields were ripped open first. And that was the problem. Traditional clearance methods were agonizingly slow. Explosive charges required teams to approach the beach under fire. Engineers with handheld detectors were guaranteed casualties. Bombardment risked scattering mines instead of detonating them, and anti-personnel mines designed to shred men before they reached the sand. Explosive Belgian gates, steel tetrahedrons, wooden frames packed with charges, all arranged with mathematical cruelty to guarantee that the sea would ignite before the first rifleman could even see the enemy. Each minefield was not a random scattering of explosives. It was a deliberate trap, a labyrinth of buried death meant to stop an invasion not through bullets, but through physics, through shock waves violent enough to snap a landing craft in half, through pressure blasts designed to hurl men into the air like broken branches. Military planners in London pored over reconnaissance reports, tracing the German defenses until their fingers ached. The more they saw, the clearer it became. No invasion force on Earth could cross those beaches unless the minefields were ripped open first. And that was the problem. Traditional clearance methods were agonizingly slow. Explosive charges required teams to approach the beach under fire. Engineers with handheld detectors were guaranteed casualties. Bombardment risked scattering mines instead of detonating them, and anti-personnel mines designed to shred men before they reached the sand. Explosive Belgian gates, steel tetrahedrons, wooden frames packed with charges, all arranged with mathematical cruelty to guarantee that the sea would ignite before the first rifleman could even see the enemy. Desperation propelled the answer. Somewhere between fear and innovation, a new concept emerged. A machine strong enough to roll over the sand, fast enough to stay ahead of enemy artillery, and violent enough to beat the minefields into submission. It would not be subtle, it would not be elegant, it would not even be safe, but it might, just might, give the soldiers a chance to reach the shore alive. Engineers began working around the clock, driven by a pressure that left no room for doubt or ethical hesitation. The Invention took shape under dim lights and sleepless eyes. A Sherman tank outfitted with a rotating drum lined with flailing chains designed to smash mines into premature detonation. Every component carried enormous risk. Every mechanism was a calculation made under the shadow of catastrophe.
Even the men building it understood the danger. Many admitted privately that the machine felt less like an engineering breakthrough and more like an invitation to disaster. And yet there was no alternative, no room for debate, no time for second chances. The fate of the invasion, the fate of Europe, the fate of millions depended on whether a handful of exhausted engineers could produce a weapon powerful enough to clear the way, yet stable enough not to destroy the very soldiers relying on it. It was a gamble of terrifying proportions, one that forced commanders to confront a brutal truth of warfare. Sometimes the greatest threat is not the enemy in front of you, but the invention you must trust to survive him. When the flail tank prototype rattled to life for the first time, its creators did not celebrate. They stood back, eyes narrow, hearts tight, knowing that they had built something meant to confront the Atlantic Wall, but unsure whether it would conquer the enemy or consume its own men first.
As the appointed day of the invasion crept closer, the pressure surrounding the flail tank grew heavier than the steel plates it was built from. What had begun as a radical engineering idea had now become a fragile lifeline, one that commanders clung to not out of confidence, but out of necessity. Yet within the ranks of those who understood its inner workings, doubt had not faded, it had evolved. The engineers who designed the machine lived in a strange limbo, caught between pride in their creation and a fear that bordered on superstition. They had watched the prototype shake itself violently during tests, the chains whipping the air with enough force to tear a man apart. They had felt the ground tremble beneath their boots as detonations erupted inches from catastrophic failure. And with each test, the same unspoken tension spread silently through the team. This machine might achieve the impossible, but it might also destroy everything around it. Technical reports, though written in the cold language of engineering, revealed the anxiety hidden between the lines. One officer described the flail as a controlled tantrum of physics. Another warned, if it malfunctions, we will lose the crew instantly. A third pushed the fear even further, noting, we have built something that obeys mathematics, not mercy. The doubt seeped upward. Field commanders, men whose decisions determined life or death for thousands, held closed-door meetings that stretched deep into the night. They studied the blueprints, they studied the failure reports, they studied the list of contingencies, each more unsettling than the last. Yes, the flail tank could clear a path through the minefields. Yes, it could do in minutes what engineers on foot could not accomplish in hours. But the commanders also knew the truth. If the machine malfunctioned at the wrong moment, it would turn into a rolling coffin. Their dilemma was cruel. They could trust a weapon that frightened its own creators, or send unprotected soldiers into minefields designed to butcher them. And as the days narrowed, even the bravest officers found themselves caught between two equally grim realities. The debates became whispered arguments. Veterans, hardened by years of combat, confessed that the flail tank unsettled them more than enemy artillery ever had. Some men claimed the machine sounded alive. Others insisted it moved with an unnatural violence, as though fighting not the mines, but the fact that it existed. Meanwhile, on the German side, a different kind of confidence took hold, one bordering on arrogance. Their Atlantic Wall had been constructed with obsessive precision, layer upon layer of obstacles meant to break any invasion before it touched land. To them, the minefields were more than weapons. They were symbols of inevitability. They believed with absolute certainty that no Allied device could force a breach. In their minds, the ocean itself stood guard for Germany. That confidence would become their blind spot. But for the Allies, the torture came not from underestimating the enemy, but from confronting their own invention.
Every tank crew assigned to the flail program trained with an intensity that pushed them past exhaustion. They memorized procedures meant to prevent fatal accidents. They learned how to keep the chain spinning even as explosions swallowed the path ahead. They were drilled not to flinch, not to slow, not to hesitate, because any hesitation could mean death. And yet, in the quiet moments before sleep, a single question gnawed at every man chosen to operate the machine. Will this weapon destroy the minds, or will it destroy us? Fear spread quietly through the barracks, the kind that never reaches official reports. For some, it settled in their gut like a stone. For others, it lingered in their hands, shaking slightly when they imagined grasping the controls as detonations thundered mere feet away. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood. The greatest conflict now was not between Allies and Germans. It was between human instinct and the cold logic of innovation. Between the desire to survive and the machine built to make survival possible. Between the known dangers of the enemy and the unknown dangers of the flail tank itself. The looming invasion forced a decision that none of them wanted to make, but that history demanded. The soldiers would drive the flail. They would trust it. They would ride into the storm with it chained to their fate, because hesitation would doom the invasion, and doubt, in the face of a war this vast, was a luxury no one could afford. As the final days ticked away, a tension settled over the Allied forces that could not be broken by reassurance or logic. It was a tension shaped by the ultimate paradox of war. To survive the Atlantic Wall, they had to place their lives in the hands of a machine powerful enough to save them, yet unpredictable enough to kill them. And in that contradiction, as the invasion drew near, the true conflict took shape. Not between armies, not between nations, but between man and the terrifying brilliance of his own creation. The night before the invasion, the Channel lay under a suffocating stillness, as if the sea itself sensed the violence that would soon be stitched into its waters. The soldiers spoke little, their breaths turning to mist as they waited for engines to ignite and destiny to unfold. Yet among all the machines poised for the assault, one weapon radiated a fear far more intimate than the enemy ever had: the flail tank. When dawn finally bled through the low clouds, the crews climbed inside their machines with the solemnity of men stepping into a cathedral before judgment. They felt the cramped metal press against their shoulders, heard the groan of chains tightening, smelled the bitterness of oil and damp canvas. There was no illusion of heroism in those moments, only the cold clarity that the line between survival and annihilation was about to thin to a whisper. Orders cracked through the radios, engines growled, and then the ramps dropped. The sea swallowed the first wave of tanks with a hiss as their tracks bit into the surf. The flail crews felt their vehicles lurch forward, every bolt and rivet shuddering against the weight of history pressing down upon them. Beneath the water, hidden explosives slept in silence, waiting for the slightest pressure to awaken them. The command came through with the finality of a verdict: "Start the flails." What followed was not the sound of a machine, but the birth of a storm. The rotating drum ignited with a metallic howl, the chains whipping outward with violent circular fury. Each link became a blur, striking the earth, the surf, and the hidden mines with the force of a blacksmith hammering the world itself. Inside the tank, the vibration was overwhelming, an unrelenting tremor that crawled up the spine and settled behind the eyes like a pulse that refused to sync with the human body. And then came the first explosion. It wasn't a distant blast. It was a detonation so close that it shook the universe inside the crew compartment. The floor lifted. The metal rang like a struck bell. Dust rained from every corner. A crew member later said that for a moment he couldn't tell whether he was still alive or had already crossed the threshold into some blinding aftershock beyond consciousness. But the tank kept moving. Second explosion. Third. Fourth. A chain of eruptions detonated across the shoreline in a violent rhythm, each blast collapsing the German minefield in bursts of water and fire, each shock wave slamming into the flail tank with enough force to rattle bones. Outside, the world dissolved into chaos. Columns of water towered into the air before crashing back down in sheets of spray. Geysers of sand and metal burst upward as buried mines erupted with savage fury. Smoke clung to the waves, curling around the tanks like dark, grasping hands. The ground shook as if the earth itself were convulsing under the assault. Inside the tank, men clung to their stations, teeth gritted so tightly some cracked their molars. The controls vibrated violently, threatening to tear free from their grasp. The noise was indescribable, an unending roar of mechanical rage and detonating death, louder than artillery, louder than thunder, so loud it seemed to reach inside the chest and squeeze. But the true terror came in the moments between the explosions. Moments when the tank groaned, buckled, or lurched unpredictably. Moments when the machine felt like a barely contained beast that might turn on its own crew. Heat surged from the flail mechanism. Warning lights flickered. Electrical systems wavered under the strain. The engine coughed once, nearly stalled, recovered, then growled as if enraged at being pushed beyond its design. One crew reported the chains striking so close that fragments of detonated mines rattled against the hull like iron hail. Another felt the tank tilt as a massive explosion tore a crater just under the front tracks. For a few seconds they believed fully that the machine would flip and bury them alive under tons of sand and steel. Still they advanced. The Germans watched from their bunkers in disbelief as the minefields, their proudest defense, their deadliest trap, were shredded apart by a single advancing row of convulsing metal beasts. Their artillery opened fire, but the flail tanks pushed through smoke and shrapnel as if possessed by the momentum of inevitability. And then the unimaginable happened. A massive mine detonation erupted less than a meter from a flail tank's drum. The shock wave hit the machine with such brutal force that part of the flail assembly bent inward, screeching like tortured metal. Inside, men were thrown sideways, slamming against the walls, vision white with pain. One fainted momentarily, another vomited. The commander thought the machine had been ripped open. But the engine roared again. The flails resumed their violent orbit. The tank surged forward. The machine, designed on the edge of disaster, had survived a blast that should have obliterated it. By the time the minefields were neutralized, the flail tanks had carved open the Atlantic wall's first wound. They had created channels of safety where moments earlier only death had waited. They had transformed chaos into opportunity and terror into momentum. But when the engines finally quieted, when the flails slowed their deadly spin, when the echoes of explosions faded into the wind, the crews sat in stunned silence, not because they had defeated the minefields, but because they knew, beyond doubt, that the machine they had trusted with their lives had walked with them on a razor's edge so close to catastrophe that even victory tasted like fear. And as they looked out over the smoke-stained horizon, one truth settled deep in their bones. The enemy they had feared that morning was not the German mines, but the machine that had carried them through them.
When the detonations finally ceased, and the violent heartbeat of the flail tanks faded into a distant tremor, an uncanny stillness settled over the battered shoreline. It was not the peaceful quiet that follows victory, nor the exhausted calm that greets survival. It was something heavier, something ancient, like the silence that returns to a battlefield after the storm has passed, when the land itself seems to exhale in disbelief at what it has witnessed. The minefields were gone. The path to the Atlantic wall lay open. But along that newly carved corridor of safety, the men who had survived found themselves wrestling with emotions they had not expected. They had prepared for fear, for explosion, for chaos. They had not prepared for the strange, sobering realization that the machine that had saved them had also nearly destroyed them. Reports written after the assault used language that tried to reduce the event to mathematics. Successful clearance, effective detonation range, acceptable equipment strain. But the men who had been inside the tanks understood what the reports did not and could not capture. They understood the raw, unpredictable violence of the invention. They understood how close they had been to being torn apart by their own machine. They understood that survival had come not just from engineering, but from luck, instinct, and a fragile partnership between man and metal. In private conversations, spoken long after the war ended, veterans of the flail tank program admitted that they had never fully trusted the machine, not even for a moment. Some said it felt alive. Others said it felt cursed. But all agreed on one truth. It had carried them through a line of death that no human could have crossed alone. And so the legacy of the flail tank became something paradoxical, a symbol of human ingenuity and a warning of human audacity. Historians would later debate its significance. Some hailed it as a miracle of engineering that helped open the gates of Europe. Others criticized its volatility, its inherent risk, its unpredictable temper. But the men who were there, the ones who smelled burning sand inside their tanks, who felt shock waves slam into their chests, who watched the earth erupt inches from their tracks, remembered it differently. To them, the flail tank was not a weapon, it was a test of courage, a test of trust, a test of the fragile boundary between creation and catastrophe. For in war, the most frightening enemy is not always the one positioned across the battlefield. Sometimes the most terrifying force is the one built by your own side. The invention created under pressure, pushed into existence by necessity, and unleashed before anyone fully understands its consequences. The beaches of Normandy would go on to become a symbol of unity, sacrifice, and liberation. But hidden beneath those narratives, buried under the weight of more famous stories, remains the shadow of the machine that helped carve the very first opening in the German defenses. A machine that roared like thunder, shook like the earth itself, and walked its crews along the knife edge between triumph and disaster. It was never given a monument. It was rarely mentioned in parades. It did not become the subject of patriotic songs. Yet its contribution stands, undeniable, and carved into history. For on that morning in June 1944, as the tide pulled the smoke back toward the sea and the sun rose over a coastline forever changed, one truth echoed across the sands. Victory was made possible not just by bravery or strategy, but by the terrifying brilliance of a machine that its own creators feared. And as the decades roll forward, the story of the flail tank remains a quiet reminder that in the darkest hours of human conflict, salvation sometimes comes from inventions born on the edge of disaster. That innovation and danger often share the same blueprint, and that the line between genius and catastrophe is as thin as a metal chain swinging over a buried mine. A line that, on D-Day, held long enough
to change the world.